Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining Decolonize to Thrive, a podcast dedicated to nourishing the soul through stimulating conversation, thought-provoking facts, and vulnerable exchange as we disseminate what it means to decolonize the many facets of our lives. I am your host, Ina Briggs, and I am so grateful that you've tuned in today. Let's dive right in. I would like to start just by introducing myself. And a question that always sort of challenges me and that I struggle with is, who am I? And so I'm going to attempt today to answer that question as I introduce myself to you. I am a mother. I am an educator. I'm a lifelong learner. I am a Black woman, born and raised on the South Side of Chicago. I am a spirit being. And as I sit here from my kitchen this morning for episode 1 of Decolonize to Thrive, I am incredibly humbled because it has been placed on my heart to create this podcast as an act of service, not only for me, but for the greater society. And though I'm humbled, I'm also nervous because I believe that this is no small feat. And I also believe that it will require a level of vulnerability and honesty that is intimidating. But I don't take this lightly, and I don't shy away from what challenges me and what pushes me. And I'm going to do it afraid. So with that said, I believe that my life experiences have all sort of culminated and come to a head in the creation or the development of this podcast. As a Black woman, born and raised on the South Side of Chicago, my experiences, I know, have positioned me to experience oppression in a way that is different from women from other races or ethnicities. And that does not take away from the experiences that we all share as women. But Black women in particular are among the group of the most oppressed people who inhabit this planet. And Chicago's South Side, full of history and beauty and culture and wealth that really cannot be quantified, also is sort of a spot in our nation where the corruption of politics and segregation and racism are palpable. In addition to that, I have been fortunate enough to experience the world and culture through my experiences as an educator. I spent some time in the Middle East teaching abroad, and to be immersed in a culture so different than mine, governed by Islamic tradition and religion, really opened my eyes to the nuances of human behavior, civilization, and culture as we know it. Having been married to a French man and experiencing the ways that culture, when it collides, can be a beautiful creation, but also can stretch you. As an educator, having the opportunity to not only teach, but to learn from my students and the community that I have been a part of teachers, of parents, of other educators, leaders, and just the thoughts that are shared in those spaces has really opened my eyes to the need for connection. And finally, I would say my childhood experiences, growing up in a household with parents who were highly devoted to their spiritual selves. And that took the form for my mother of religion. She was an evangelist, assistant pastor in a non-denominational Christian church. And my father explored so many different religions in my formative years. I remember learning about Seventh-day Adventists and the Hebrew Israelites, and just overall being exposed to so many different ways of thought from a religious standpoint. I was also a Catholic school student, and I went to Mass and took communion and was really confused growing up most of my life about religion and understanding what was right for me. And it has been a journey that I will say I'm so grateful that I've taken even into my adulthood, because I believe all of these experiences have really shaped the person I am today and the curiosity that still exists for understanding human behavior. And so I share this because all of it has led to the development of this podcast. Last year, I began to, as many of us do, experience lots of setbacks in relationships, in finances, career, family. And the pandemic really exposed the need for reflection and introspection, to sit and think about who I am and who I was at the age of a 36-year-old woman at that time, and where I want to be and how to get there, which can seem daunting. But one thing that was clear to me that I needed to do was to develop a self-love journey. And the second thing that was clear was the need for finding my tribe. And so I hope that in putting this podcast out into the universe, it will be the continuation of this journey of loving myself and of attracting a community of listeners and people who I will also follow that will contribute to that personal journey. So before we get into the content of the podcast, I would like to make a couple of statements about what this podcast is and what it is not. For those of you who are Myers-Briggs fans and personality test gurus, I'm an INFJ, the advocate. And I believe a part of me is doing this because of that deep need to advocate for the most vulnerable in society. And I'm an idealist inspired by my predecessors, Martin Luther King Jr., Audre Lorde, Sojourner Truth, Bell Hooks, James Baldwin, so many. And I believe in the ripple theory. Every ripple can create a wave that changes our world. Even if I don't live to see what I have set out to do, I believe in building on the work that my ancestors have done. What this podcast is, or I hope for it to be, is soul food. I hope that when you tune in, it will feel like healing for the soul. I'm feeling drawn to create the change that I seek in the world. And so what this is my invitation to allowing the spirit to use me and my higher self to speak through me to others. What it is a learning opportunity for myself and for all of us. It is also an invitation for you as a listener to join me in exploring what feels most honest, true, and what resonates with you. So I will share my thoughts, resources, and experiences. I will bring on guests who will do the same in the hopes that we create even the smallest ripple in society and grant ourselves and others permission to embrace our truest selves unapologetically. So what it isn't going to be right for everyone, whether you are on the journey of decolonization or not. It is not a model of perfection or a foolproof plan or roadmap to decolonizing yourself. I don't proclaim to have the answers. This is very much so a learning experience for me. It isn't politically correct, which again, what does that mean when we talk about a topic such as decolonizing ourselves? So I will speak from the heart, not as an authority on the topic of decolonization. Again, this is a very personal journey of exploration, and I hope that the byproduct of it is in some way a form of shared liberation. So as we get into the content, I want to set the intention right now. I want to invite you to listen and remain present so as to be curious and find your truth within the words that are spoken. The beauty of podcasts, I believe, is that they can create a natural pathway to diversity of perspective and curiosity. And so as listeners, I hope that this will be interactive. I definitely want to hear from you as we wrap up the podcast. I'll share some information for how to reach out and share your thoughts. I believe that this is a shared opportunity for learning. So the purpose of episode 1 is really to start with a foundational understanding of colonization before we even talk about decolonization. And I assume that if you are tuning into this podcast, you already have a pretty basic understanding of colonization. And so I hope that what I share today is either a refresher, and for those of you who are curious but don't quite understand it, that this will be useful in developing an understanding of what colonization means. I've done some research and found a resource that I think did a good job of defining what colonialism is. And so according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, colonialism is a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. And so when I reflect just on that, domination stands out to me. And I think about European Americans being the group that has dominated almost all groups of people across our globe and subjugated them in one way or another. It continues to say the term colony actually comes from the Latin word colonus, which means farmer. This root reminds us that the practice of colonialism usually involved the transfer of population to a new territory where their rivals lived as permanent settlers while maintaining political allegiance to their country of origin. And so as an African-American woman, what that means to me is being displaced. So my ancestors being taken from Africa and then placed in the Americas, and still wanting to keep that loyalty and that connection to their native land. The legitimacy of colonialism has been the subject of debate among figures in the canon of political philosophy. At least since the Crusades and the conquest of the Americas, political theorists have confronted the tension between ideas about justice and natural law and the practice of European domination. In the 19th century, the contradiction between liberal ideals and colonial practice became particularly acute as the dominion of Europe over the rest of the world reached its zenith. And so to sum that up, in the 19th century is where we began to see the peak of European domination over the rest of the world. Colonialism is not a modern phenomenon. World history is full of examples of one society gradually expanding by incorporating adjacent territory and settling its people on newly conquered territory. In the 16th century, colonialism changed decisively because of the technological developments in navigation that began to connect more remote parts of the world. The modern European colonial project emerged when it became possible to move large groups of people across the ocean and to maintain political control in spite of geographical dispersion. So this entry uses the term colonialism to describe the process of European settlement, violent dispossession, and political domination over the rest of the world, including the Americas, Australia, and parts of Africa and Asia. And so that's the conclusion of the information from the Stanford Encyclopedia. But when I think about that, what stands out to me is the experience of trauma. Colonialism and thinking of it as just a displacement doesn't do it justice. These people were traumatized and continue to be traumatized today. And we'll talk about that more as we get into decolonization. The final definition that I would like to share for colonization, I think, sheds light on the various types of ways that people can be colonized. Colonialism is generally classified by one of 5 overlapping types according to the practice's particular goals and consequences on the subjugated territory and its indigenous peoples. So these are settler colonialism, which is typically thought of as a genocidal practice. Exploitation colonialism, when you think about labor and exploiting people in order to gain profit. Plantation colonialism, which refers more to the permanent and semi-permanent settlements in a new land. Surrogate colonialism, which involves a foreign power exchange. And finally, an internal colonialism, which is where you have internal division within a region itself. And so I've took this information from thoughtco.com, which is another site that gave a broader understanding of what colonialism is. And this is actually the first time that I've become aware of the multiple types of colonization. Now let's flip it on its opposite side to get a basic understanding of what decolonization is. Again, the purpose of this podcast is to think about what are the ways that we can decolonize ourselves? Is it even possible? What does it look like? What are the barriers? What are the challenges? And what are the benefits? How can I profit from going through this process? So an incredible source and site that I've found that I encourage you as listeners to visit, it has a wealth of resources related to decolonization, is racialequitytools.org. And they define it as decolonization theory and practice. And their definition for decolonization is it refers to writing back against the ongoing colonialism and colonial mentalities that permeate all institutions and systems of government. Furthermore, it reads, indeed, decolonization demands an indigenous framework and a centering of indigenous land, indigenous sovereignty, and indigenous ways of thinking. Okay, so returning back to our indigenous ways. Okay. And as I read that, I think about what does that look like for me as an African-American woman? I've spent my entire life in America and identifying with what it means to be American. Is this even possible? And if I'm honest, it feels, as much as it feels necessary, it almost feels intimidating and too big to accomplish. So racialequitytools.org continues to state that rebuilding culture must interrogate colonialism's turmoil on the inner world and psyche. The book Black Skin, White Mask by Franz Fanon talks a lot about this. Authors artists and activists draw on his writings as they create new narratives to counter mainstream framings in history books, public monuments, and pop culture that have seeped into public consciousness. And so that, again, is a part of the decolonization process. In practice, some of the ways that we've seen decolonization be played out are some examples such as the indigenous youth protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline, indigenous takedown of Confederate monuments, and people of color rewriting historical representation in New York's American Museum of Natural History. So again, these are just a few of the ways that people have already started to really get into the work of decolonizing. Finally, one last source that I would like to share with you that outlines what it means to decolonize. Again, another really great resource is speakingofmedicine.org. And what I love about the way that they define decolonization is that they state a more multi-layered definition of this process. And it's one that is new to me. And I think it really gets to the root of how even in the movement to decolonize, we have to decolonize the movement because we're so satiated with racial hierarchical ways of thinking and methodologies that even in movements that aim to eliminate oppression, we somehow find a way to constantly uphold whiteness and hierarchies. And so Dr. Ijeoma Opara states that even within the decolonization movement, we have to decolonize the processes. And she gives us a few ways to do that. The first being getting comfortable with multiformity and fluidity. Okay, so she states that decolonization has multiple definitions and that's okay. It is a complex concept and process, and the movement should allow to accommodate for multiple definitions, even as its meaning shifts, depending on the sociopolitical positionality of the actor, the positionality of their audience, the person's geographical location, their colonial history, their role inside or outside of academia, right? And so just this notion that there's one right way to decolonize is rooted in whiteness. As we know that more often than not, one of the characteristics of white supremacy is there's only one right way to do something, right? It centers an individual or one way of thinking and shuns other ways of thought and diverse perspective. So again, the first thing that we must do to decolonize is get comfortable with the multiformity of it and make sure that it remains fluid and that we're constantly open to the evolution of what this actually means. The second tip or way to decolonize is to ground decolonization in the work of majority world leaders. The voices of indigenous people, scholars, thinkers, strategists, activists have to be centered when we think about decolonial efforts. Their perspectives, lived experiences, expertise, and knowledge systems come first, and it must inform all other work. They must inform language, framework, strategies, and more. And so, you know, again, divesting from whiteness and not looking for this sort of credible source that is oftentimes rooted in an Ivy League degree, right? Or an institution that upholds whiteness to tell us that this is the right way to go about the process. Instead, we must amplify the voices of the indigenous and the people whose lived experiences are rooted in decolonizing. They need to be the authorities in the work. Third, we must center intersectionality and interdependence. And so another one of the features of white supremacy is this need to be individualistic, every man for itself sort of mentality, whereas We understand that the health of all communities across the globe are informed by social and structural determinants and policies that lead to conditions that affect us all. And so if we are only thinking about ourselves and we don't approach the process of decolonizing in a way that allows us to examine the ways that all people are affected by colonialism, then we continue to do harm. So we need to integrate movements that already exist that work toward dismantling intersecting systems of oppression. And we need to draw on the wisdom and the work of others who have come before us. And we need to look at the ways that racialized people have been oppressed, disenfranchised across the globe. This brings me to a thought about, in some ways, how the feminist movement, though it aims to free women in a way that should be liberating, can be so harmful because it at times can leave out groups such as Black women, such as women of color, such as our trans and LGBTQ community members, because it has been in so many ways centered on the white woman's perspective. And so when we think about decolonizing, we absolutely must look at intersectional identities and our interdependence and how we are all in some way harmed by the colonialism that has ruled our nation. Dr. Opara states that we must emphasize a critical analysis of power. So power is fundamental to colonialism, right? Not just then, but even now, power structures still govern, for example, even the media, what we do and don't hear about in the news, and the oppression that is so deeply ingrained into our institutions and structures in society. And so it is important that we examine power when we talk about decolonization, and that we, divest from structures that continue to put people in unearned positions of power. And we need to challenge a way of operating that maintains one group being dominant and other groups being oppressed. Finally, Dr. Opara states, in order for us to decolonize, we have to return to source and prioritize it. To overcome colonization and achieve decolonization and liberation, we would need to reject the external as well as the internalized white Euro-American gaze and standards, and instead return to the source. So this means that we must make the journey into our individual and collective self to recover, reclaim, and restore our indigenous cultures, languages, technologies, art forms, histories, religions, and sciences, our stories, our identities, our essence. We must name them ourselves, and we must create our own narratives. We can position ourselves to speak truth to power through taking pride in the complex beauty of who we are. And that in so many ways is the biggest challenge for us, because it is just not accepted in mainstream society to veer away from whiteness and still be honored and respected. When I think about the indigenous peoples of America and how they have gone through so many of the necessary rituals and returning to source in their own trauma work, it required them to go back to spiritual practices and to honor the land, and to think of themselves not just mind and body, but holistically. And considering, myself as a career woman, as a Black woman in America, it's almost taboo to acknowledge the spiritual identity in mainstream, in the workplace, in meetings, in dialogue with colleagues, to talk about more than just the mental or the physical, and start to bring in the spiritual aspects of our identities. It is not embraced in society, and in some ways looked at as sort of foolery. This mystical thing that no one can prove exists doesn't have a place in our world, and outside of a checkbox of a religion that you may feel that you belong to. And so it's a returning to the essence of who we are. And many of the indigenous tribes and the African diaspora, the communal ways that we've operated have been so rooted in something greater than ourselves, and the need for acknowledging our spiritual selves. And so to be denied that in a lot of ways is, it is to totally not acknowledge who people of color are. And it requires us to leave parts of our identity at the door when we enter into mainstream society. And so again, she talks about returning to source and prioritizing it. And so that wraps up the conclusion of just developing a shared set of terms and understanding of what it means to be colonized, and what it then means to decolonize. We haven't even scratched the surface yet. Every single guest that I will bring on, all of the content that I will share in this podcast will continue to help us develop an understanding of what does it mean to decolonize and how can we do this? And so as we wrap up episode 1, I want to always leave you with some questions to ponder. And so for my fellow listeners who identify as Black or as a person of color, I would love to ask you to consider pondering whether you have ever thought of yourself as an Indigenous person. Where do you feel most tethered to? Is it America, or is it the land of your ancestors? And why? And for my listeners that identify as European American, have you ever explored your personal relationship with America or to Europe? And where do you feel most tethered to, and why? Finally, we will wrap up the podcast with what I call Thrive with 5. So my 5 takeaways from our first episode, and from each episode, just as sort of a summary to kind of solidify the learning that has been helpful for me, and that I hope will also be helpful for you. So the first point is, as I think of our society, and I hear it often referred to as a westernized society, I'm starting to think about what does it mean to look at our society as more of a colonized society. Have we ever truly not been colonized as Americans? People of color, particularly in America. In so many ways, we are still a colonized society. My second point is we are, in so many ways, unconsciously kept in colonial mindsets and reminded of our colonization when we observe monuments and structures that uphold white supremacy all around us. So we talked about the indigenous movement to remove these statues across America and these monuments, especially during, the George Floyd protests and during 2020. Why are they still there in the first place? Right? And what is it doing to our psyches to constantly observe these things and not feel a sense of outrage? Have we just become complacent? Have we just numbed out and not even considered what this is subconsciously telling us each and every day as people of color? My third point, social media and the media in general is another tool used for oppression and domination. Just as technology gave European Americans a leg up in the 19th century, I believe it persists today. And so I am going to be more curious about the ways that technology is used as a colonial tool for oppression. My fourth point, to decolonize means more than to eliminate an internal connection to our oppressors. It also means to physically give back, right? People of color are owed reparations. It means to renew, to restore, to repair the damage to indigenous peoples, to people of the African diaspora, to all people who have been oppressed by European Americans. And so when I think about decolonizing, it's not just a movement that is internal or that can be achieved through spiritual reconnection to ourselves. It is the actual restorative justice for communities that have been made vulnerable and oppressed and suppressed in society. And so it is an action as well on a very physical level. And finally, my fifth Thrive to 5 point is decolonization is fluid. And there are multiple ways that this theory and practice can be defined. But most importantly, it should be understood through the lens of intersectionality. And for those whose lived experiences lend expertise to its development. And so all of my guests, again, will represent those whose lived experiences exemplify the practice of decolonization. And on that note, I will wrap us up with a quote. This one is my favorite quote, and each episode will conclude with a quote that relates to our journey together, and that sums up what I would like for us to be thinking about until we come back together again. And this quote states, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." This quote has served as a motto for many activist groups in Australia and elsewhere, but it is credited to Leela Watson, an artist, activist, and academic. I thank you so much for tuning in to episode 1 of Decolonize to Thrive. And I look forward to hearing from you, my listeners, about your thoughts and feelings on episode 1. What resonated with you? And I would love to hear your responses to our questions to ponder. So feel free to email decolonizetothrive@gmail.com. That is decolonize2thrive@gmail.com. Or you may call and leave a voicemail at 312-843-3033. Again, that is 312-843-3033. And I will be featuring some listener responses on the next episode and subsequent episodes as they come in. So thank you so much for being such a crucial part of this podcast and for joining me on this journey to decolonization. And you will hear from me in 2 weeks. Thank you.